Well, this past week I was at a clergy meeting here in Dutchess County of Episcopal clergy, and because we talk about such riveting topics, the subject came up of whether people were letting their congregation sit during these long gospel passages that we've had for the last few weeks. And they said, "Richard, what are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, St. Peter's is made of sterner stuff than that. They don't have to sit. They're standing through the gospel." And what a gospel it is. It's a wonderful, very complex story in the context of other complex stories, such as the reading from Ezekiel. And although the reading from Ezekiel is very strange, seems like kind of a Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of tableau, it is also clearly meant to be a story that talks about how God's power is revealed in bringing life to things that seem to have died. Now, Barbara Brown Taylor, who's a great preacher and I often look at in terms of preparation for sermons, said, one of the wonderful things among many about the Jewish Testament is that at least people have the good sense in the Jewish Testament that once they die, they stay dead. Not so in the Christian Testament. So we have here in John's Gospel this extraordinary story. Now again, what's always important to remember is John is really very complex. It's very much kind of a love-hate relationship that many of us have with John's Gospel. The problems are many. It is certainly the most beautiful, the most sophisticated gospel. Even from the various first generation of Christians, though, people saw that it was a different kind of gospel from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So it was always set apart in people's minds. And for us as contemporary Christians, what sets it apart is not all good news. John's gospel is permeated with anti-Jewish sentiment. It is not based in history, but is instead based in John's antipathy for the Jewish people because they refuse to embrace Jesus as the Messiah. So every chance they get in John's gospel, the Jewish people are criticized and condemned for this. And it is not only unfair, it's not historical. So there's that problem. There's also a problem that is often cited in the way that John sees Jesus in relationship to God. Unlike the other earlier Gospels, in John's Gospel, there's a very elevated, divine sense of who Jesus is in this life. So much so that many people have said that John actually falls into the heresy that was the first great heresy of the Christian tradition, which was called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism, among many things, believed that Jesus went through the appearance of being human, but was actually always fully divine. If you will, it was just really a front of humanity with no doubt of his full divinity. So you get passages like we've just had where Jesus prays, and because, in John's view, Jesus is the Son of God and really of God completely, why would he need to pray to God? And why would God not immediately grant whatever Jesus prayed for? So John characteristically adds the footnote and says he really did this just for the sake of the people listening. He knew that God could hear him and would grant him his request, but he did it to show the people who needed to be taught. All this would suggest a Jesus that is not fully embracing humanity or that we can identify with. But actually, there's also good news in John's Gospel. Because, strangely, again and again, the very personal details about Jesus emerge in John's gospel. The very moving passages that speak about relationship and emotion come out in John. So this very human, if you will, emotional life of Jesus is very present in John's gospel. So there are moments of great exaltation and celebration. There are moments of deep compassion and connection. And in this gospel, there are moments of grief and loss. So that therefore we can approach the Jesus in John's gospel with an ability to identify with what we're hearing. So a couple of things. John loves giving us nice long details in these stories that we've been hearing. So you get a very clear understanding of the timeline and the dramatic setting of this gospel. There remain things that are very perplexing. Why did Jesus not immediately leave to go be with his friend Lazarus? John would have us say it was all to show God's power and God's glory. But again, not terribly human in its response. But certainly the key passage about emotion is the part where both Martha first and Mary second come out to meet Jesus before he gets to their home, and both say to him, "If you'd only been here, our brother whom you loved would not have died." That's a profound human expression of loss. You know, just over a year ago, when my friend Richard Mayberry died, I had spoken to him on the Sunday night, and he was his usual rather cranky self. I told him I was coming up the next day, which was Monday in Columbus Day weekend, and I would be there in time to make sure he got to the very fancy rehab that he wanted to go to that had crystal chandeliers and a view of the harbor in the village that he lived in. And so I got up early and I drove up to Boston, and when I was about 10 minutes away from the hospital called, and we misconnecting with each other. When finally I spoke to a nurse, I said, "I'll be right there. Don't worry, I'll be there to meet with the social worker." I knew Richard would never forgive me if I missed the chance to get him into this rehab. And "I'll be right there." And the nurse stopped me and she said, "Richard, I have to tell you that Richard passed away 10 minutes ago." And even though I was on my way, and when I got to his hospital room, it upended me emotionally. I really didn't know what to do. It came as an unexpected thing. There was no indication that he was going to pass away. And I really didn't know what I was supposed to do, both as his friend, but also then all the things that would need to be done for someone who has just died, and I was the executor. So what I did was I sat down, and I said the prayers in the prayer book, which I had with me, for someone who had just died. And then I just sat there. And it reminded me of how often in my pastoral role with people who are dying, how often their desire to be with them when they die isn't fulfilled. And they often say, as I was saying that morning, "If only I had been there 15 minutes earlier, I could have been with him before he died." And I think that very human response is what is behind Jesus. In the question that the statement actually, that both Mary and Martha say to Jesus was, even more than "if you had only been here," they say, "If you had only been here, he wouldn't have died." So we have the passage which is so extraordinary in the Christian Testament, which is that Jesus wept. Now, in identifying with Jesus in this very human moment, in a gospel that does not bristle with human moments, there's something to pay attention to and to remark about and to be cognizant of. And that is, it's clear in this gospel passage that in our own experience of life and death with people that we love, being a good person and leading a good life does not exempt you from terrible things, from illness or suffering, from accidents. They are very much part of our humanity. And our profound faith and our belief does not say to us, if you believe, nothing bad will happen to you. You know, this was very clear to me in the aftermath of September 11th. There were two families in our parish there, a very small parish, who had two men who died that day. And as if you remember, no one really knew that first day going into that night what the extent of what had happened. We all feared for the worst. And early the next morning, around 5 in the morning, I got a call from a member of the parish saying that his husband had not come home. And could I keep him in my prayers? And I said, well, I'll be right over, David. I'll be with you. So I sat with David, and while I was sitting there with David through the morning, another call came in saying that another parishioner was missing. And so for that week after September 11th, I went back and forth between the two families. And what that taught me was that I had no answer as to why this could have happened in the face of a loving, all-powerful God. All I could know is that throughout that, at least for me, and I hope for the people that I was connected to, they felt God's presence with them. Not an exemption from suffering or harm, but the knowledge that we believe in a God that is with us. And not just with us, but completely with us in our own lives. That's what's clear, I think, in Jesus' crying. In the tears that he sheds, there is the idea that here is the Messiah. No doubt of that in John's Gospel. But a Messiah that cries along with our losses. And by, therefore, association, it's logical that God in some way cries as well in our losses, in our fears, in our anxiety. Being a person of faith does not mean that you'll never experience pain. But it does mean that you'll never experience the absence of God. We believe in a God that is with us at all times. And so as we come to Holy Week, in just a week's time, Palm Sunday is next Sunday, we'll be reminded in the stories that we hear about Jesus' arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, and finally his resurrection, of a Messiah that is not just mighty warrior or king, but one of us. And if one of us, then one of us with God as well. And that ends up being good news. And ends up being an affirmation of a life that does not end with our own experience of death, but an understanding and a belief of God that is always present with us. Amen.